Hello there everyone, welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. It's History with Sai here today to discuss with you further on the US civil rights topic we've been doing this term. If you haven't already, do check out the previous videos in this series where we've got ourselves right up here now to the 1950s. I'd strongly recommend you check them out. And if you already have checked them out, then welcome, here we are at the next lesson. Do remember, as always, these are catered towards the student level, so our content will provide us with some key knowledge and practicing our historical skills along the way. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So we finished our previous video with, of course, the fallout with the Democrat Party, how they have these two split, divided groups now. We had the more moderate wing with Truman, who wanted to push for civil rights, try and secure these rights as time was going on. And we had the more southern Dixiecrat wing with Storm Thurmond, the contention that was occurring in the southern states. Now we're here in the 1950s. A big change is about to happen with the actual federal government. What's going to happen is Truman actually decides not to stand in the election, and Adlai Stevenson is going to try and run for it instead. And we're going to see a big shock upset here with the Democrats actually losing the election and the Republicans gaining power once again. How does all this happen? How is this going to affect African Americans and civil rights? Well, let us find out. So as said, the Democrats, because of all the infighting and problems they've caused themselves, Truman suffered a reduced majority as a consequence of all the infighting with the Democrats. And this only worsened once he got into his second term as president. He had a lot of problems with foreign policy. His biggest blunder is arguably the Korean War. This is a conflict that they got involved in as the Cold War was occurring. Now, we don't really get much into the foreign policy with the Cold War that's happening. But all the background we need to understand is that after the Second World War, the Soviet Union became really powerful, just like America. It began to control and dominate the eastern side of the world. So Germany, for example, was split up into four main zones, and the Soviets controlled the eastern side, and then America and its allies, mainly Britain and France, controlled the western side. But this is happening in other nations throughout. For instance, Poland falls to Soviet rule, Hungary, most of the eastern states, and another one that potentially was going to fall to communism was Korea. And so Truman got involved in Korea because he believed in what's called martial aid. He believed it was America's duty to intervene and support these nations and prevent them from falling into communist rule. And if one nation fell to communism, then others would follow, till eventually America would be left alone as the only liberal democracy left in power. So they got involved in Korea, but it didn't really go so well for them. Many Americans did not really support the conflict, and this provided an opening for this man here, Dwight Eisenhower. Now, who is Dwight Eisenhower? He has been in the army for many years at this point. He hails from Kansas and initially was a poor farm boy. And this poor farm boy was going to grow up to become the key general of the Second World War. In fact, by this point, he is now the supreme commander in Europe. He's managed to oversee NATO, the National Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was part of Truman's idea of having America on the world stage to intervene and protect other nations, a defensive alliance made up of all the Western European countries and America. During the Second World War, Eisenhower, as the main general, had commanded the victorious Allied forces to victory. Therefore, he was a war hero and represented this charismatic image of someone who was exceptionally popular and therefore quite key for someone who may want to, for a party that may wish to win the presidential election. Now, Eisenhower didn't really like federal government activism in domestic affairs. He believed in a slightly smaller government than what had become accustomed to in America during the New Deal era. However, he understood that you couldn't just simply get rid of the New Deal. After all, it had become a massive foundation within America throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, and it'd be quite a bold move for someone to just remove all the New Deal legislation that had been brought in and admittedly had seemed to have repaired America after all those years, whether that was indeed the New Deal consensus or it was actually the military spending during the Second World War and use that to bolster their economy. The debate can roll on with that. But all the same, Eisenhower was the one who was going to win the election and come to power. But what exactly was he promising when he became the leader of the Republicans when he was brought in and decided to run for the presidency? Well, the key part that we need to understand for Eisenhower is this idea of dynamic republicanism or dynamic conservatism. Now, the idea of this is, as I say, he doesn't really like the New Deal. He thinks it's a bit too interventionist. He thinks it's a bit too much for America to do. However, he understood that it would really be quite foolish to try and get rid of it. So instead, he wanted to run on a more progressive wing of the Republican Party. The two things that he personally described this as was that he was going to be conservative when it came to money, the economy, and liberal when it came to the people in America. So, for instance, on the economy, he believed that all the defense spending that had happened throughout Roosevelt's era and Truman had carried on with intervention in the Korean War would have to stop. It would have to scale down quite dramatically. So, in short, he wanted to really control defense spending, really balance the budget, because he believed they needed a strong economy, because without a strong economy, one did not have any real security or defense. Eisenhower went so far as to call out the two political parties, because even the Republicans wanted to still carry on this high military spending. He called out this thing called the military industrial complex. What is this complex term? Well, it was Eisenhower's way of describing that he believed many people in America, the factories, the armaments, the ones making the tanks, making the bullets, were the ones who were profiting from war, and they were using the defense industry to make themselves lots of money. And he didn't really support that, and he wanted to curb and put a stop to it. All the same, he got onto the Republican ticket with this agenda and, of course, went on to try and practice it. And, of course, in doing so, this meant that he could spend the money on other things in the American economy instead. For instance, we see throughout the 1950s, Eisenhower's ideas seemed to be quite successful. He really wanted to buy into this idea of a more consumerism led economy. What is consumerism? Well, it's very like what the 1920s was, where people have great interest in spending money, getting on the stock market, buying things like cars, the new televisions, and of course owning property as well, particularly owning houses that they could try and buy. And we see this actually is quite successful in the 1950s. See, GDP actually grows in this time span by about 40%. The average family income for money rises by a further 30%. And this is probably the most telling figure, is that inflation and unemployment are quite low. For instance, in 1953 to 1957, the cost of living rose about 3% a year, but wages, particularly in factory work, rose by nearly 9%. So you imagine you're going to go buy a house, it's going to cost you 3% more, but you've got 9% extra money to work with. So it balanced out quite nicely, and the American people do end up richer. And it's a big reason why the American people actually vote Eisenhower in for a second term, because the economy is doing so well. This is also helped by other things, of course. It's not just Eisenhower's policy. For instance, America had been the one to win the Second World War, and they gained a lot of money from their rivals in Europe and also Japan. For instance, their economies have really suffered, and so with Truman having sold Marshall Aid and the Lend-Lease Roosevelt had got during the Second World War, the interest and the repayments from those nations really pay off quite nicely. American industry also benefited now from much cheaper fuel prices, especially for oil, and they also found themselves benefiting from a booming population. After the Second World War, there was a famous baby boom that had happened and was stretching here, not just in the 1940s, but in the 1950s as well. The American population actually rose from about 150 million up to 180 million in just 10 years. That's a massive 20% growth they went under. And of course, with this, that also meant you now have people wanting to buy those homes, wanting to buy more clothes and toys for their children. And of course, it increases the growth of their industries, especially the service industries, the ones that serve customers and serve people that are traveling, going to restaurants, going to motels, and of course, using their cars to go to petrol stations. We actually see as a consequence of all of this a white flight. You should remember when I talked about the Great Migration a few lessons ago, how African Americans wanted to leave the southern states to the urban cities in the northern states. And now we have a bit of the reverse happening because of all the new properties that are being built, particularly the American suburbs, colloquially called Levitt towns, suburban builders known as the Levitt brothers. We have a white flight. This was post Second World War. We have a mass exodus of white Americans who were leaving inner city areas to go to the Levitt town instead. Many of these houses were also for young veterans as well from the war. We actually find that 17,000 homes are built by 1947 and they're housing 80,000 residents by the time the baby booms got underway in the early 1950s. As said, they were also quite affordable because the GDP kept increasing. They roughly only cost about 2.5 times the average family wage. which, when you compare it to housing prices in the 21st century, is a really big bargain for someone who wants to buy a house today. So there we are. So it sounds, in terms of this conservative idea with money that Eisenhower was talking about, it actually was going to be quite successful. It seemed to be appealing to to lots of people. However, it's all well and good saying that he's conservative with money, but the second thing Eisenhower promised was to be liberal with the people. And on the surface, it would seem Eisenhower is trying to do this. He actually did quite a few good things, you could say, for the average American family. He raised the minimum wage in 1955. He gave federal aid to education to create more school buildings, hire more school teachers, and also provide some low cost loans to college students who tried to get more qualifications and achieve higher paying jobs. He also even made an interstate highway to benefit people who were buying cars and wishing to travel more. And he also even improved Social Security benefits, adding $10 million to its coverage by 1954 alone. So this, on the surface, sounds quite good for the people. However, we're looking here at the African American civil rights, and we have to ask ourselves, for them in America, is Eisenhower doing the same kind of thing? And the answer initially is no. So despite everything that Eisenhower is saying, all of his promises of being liberal with people and conservative with the economy, this sadly seems to only be for white people in America at this time. For instance, there were two key cases in the early to mid 1950s that really proved this case. One of them concerns a lady called Autherine Lucy. Now, she was a university student at Alabama, and she wanted to attend university. However, they would not admit her because of her race, because they said because that she was African American, she was not allowed to be there. Again, remember, southern states were different. They're still dominated by the Dixiecrats at this time. And so these Dixiecrats are making sure their segregationist Jim Crow laws are still in place and therefore prevent African Americans from attending university like her. However, there has been some change. And you have to give some credit to Eisenhower here. He actually puts a man called Earl Warren on the Supreme Court, and he becomes the Chief Justice. And he helps pass something called the Brown versus Board of Education federal decision in 1954. And this actually overturns Plessy v. Ferguson and permits people of all colour, of all ethnicity, to attend desegregated schools and education. Now, this sounds on the surface like a great thing, a great de jure progress. However, despite this, Autherine Lucy is not able to attend the university. She has to win her own civil rights case with the help of a gentleman called Thurgood Marshall. But with his help, she of course is now able to attend the university. However, she still faces much abuse and much backlash that sadly occurs for her. She's spat on, she's hurled at by white protesters, she's even attacked. There are some reports she actually was locked in a locker room while trying to attend on her first day. And what makes it even worse, the actual teachers and lecturers at the university don't support her. And eventually they start making claims that she's bad mouthing the school, bad mouthing the university, and they actually force her to be expelled in 1956. Another tragic case that happens concerns Emmett Till. This was a young 14-year-old boy from Chicago who was visiting some of his family who were living in the southern states of Mississippi. While he was there, he spoke to or flirted with, there was some rumors that he wolf whistled at her, a white woman while he was at a store getting some food. Working out that he had done this, and two white southern men found him in the night. They attacked him and they pulled him down to the Mississippi River, where they severely beat him, mutilated, and then discarded his dead body in the river soon after. The two killers were found out, but the all-white jury concluded that there was not enough evidence and they were not convicted for their killings. This is most disturbing when straight after their release from court, they instantly bragged to the press about what they did. There's a very famous article, William Bradford, a journalist in 1956, in Look magazine, where he had paid these two men for their story. One of the men said that he was tired of black children coming down to the southern states, stirring up trouble, and he wanted to make an example of Till. And he believed that as long as the whites had power in the South, they would never let the blacks control government. And if it meant he had to kill some more, then he gladly would. Now, I paraphrase what he said there because he says some very racially charged words in the article that I'm not going to repeat. But all the same, his actions speak louder than his words regardless. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy. Whether he was playfully gesturing or as a Northerner did not fully understand the laws that had been built into the southern states, all the same, murdering him the way they did and discarding his body was hardly the way to do it. When Emmett Till's body was returned to the North, his mother ensured that his coffin would be open and people who were possessed by the church would see his body in the state it was when it was found. And I'm not going to show the image here either, but it's quite a harrowing image of the sheer damage they'd done to him. He's barely recognizable visually after what had happened. And what was the government's reaction to all of this? To Autherine Lucy being expelled from school, to Emmett Till's brutal murder down south? It was nothing. Eisenhower and his government did not react at all to these tragedies. Despite what he has said about being liberal for the people, about wanting an America for all, for peace and prosperity, when it came to African Americans, he did not act. He only acted by putting Earl Warren on the Warren Court and having him make decisions, the unanimous actions to get those laws passed. But when those laws were passed, there was still inaction. There wasn't much to enforce it. And this is why we have this issue of de jure versus de facto progress. They can have some lawful changes, but until they're practiced and embedded and ensured in actual society, it's hard to say that the African Americans are gaining any civil rights and getting any closer to equality at all. Will this change when we get deeper into Eisenhower's second term? Will he become a more active president? Will civil rights finally improve even further for African Americans? Well, that's what we're going to find out in our following lesson. As always, I hope you found this video quite insightful, or you found it quite useful. So, of course, do make sure you subscribe as well to make sure you're keeping track and up to date with our lessons here. And, of course, engage in the comments below. How are you finding these lessons? What are you learning? What's standing out to you? That's quite interesting, quite fascinating, as we learn this course content together. With all that said, I'll see you in the following video where we consider Eisenhower's later actions and maybe how the civil rights movement has to start taking action again itself. It can't just rely on the courts. Maybe we need some more activism like we saw in the 1940s especially to make this change, not just change in law, but also change in reality as well. So thank you as all for watching. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.